and the conclusion to our four-part series on radiculopathy. And today I have just a brief exercise and a brief demonstration for you that will put the finishing touches and cap off every possible consideration regarding radiculopathy, at least as far as concerns the work that we do as qualified medical evaluators and the discussions of radiculopathy that we see in Chapter 15 of the AMA guides. And let's just review some of what we've discussed so far in this series. In part one of this series, we talked about the nature of true objective findings, and that discussion has been such an eye-opener and such a revelation for many doctors. It was probably one of my most satisfying blog broadcasts to date, simply based upon the amount of feedback that I received from doctors. So thank you very much for your comments and feedback on that. And then in part two of this series, we talked about the sensory, the motor, and the reflex examination, and how to tease out the truly objective findings in those parts of our neurologic evaluation. And then in part three of this program, we talked about the nerve root stretch tests. And at this point in the program, from part three onward, we began to limit our discussion for illustration purposes mostly to lumbar spine radiculopathy. And to illustrate various principles and topics, we focused specifically on the L5 nerve root. And we discussed the many faces of L5 radiculopathy. And then in part four of this program, we talked about consistency and inconsistency findings in radiculopathy, and we talked about how to look at the examinee globally and how to look at the entire constellation of the clinical picture of L5 radiculopathy. And we talked about the many manifestations that the L5 nerve root has on the muscles of the lower extremity. And we went far beyond the examination requirements of the AMA guides, and we looked at the many manifestations of L5 radiculopathy and the many ways that those manifestations can present, both in our physical examination of the examinee and then also in our assessment of the impact of L5 radiculopathy upon the activities of daily living of the examinee. So that was a comprehensive and global look at our examinees with L5 radiculopathy. Well, throughout the course of this broadcast, I've received many calls and emails from doctors asking me, well, what about the cervical spine? What about cervical radiculopathy? Doctors would call me and tell me that they have a cervical spine case, and could I provide more discussion about the cervical spine. So today I want to give just a little bit of attention to the cervical spine, just to be fair and to be non-discriminatory to the cervical spine, because as we all know, we get cervical spine cases with about equal frequency as we get lumbar spine cases. So today we'll provide a little bit of fairness and a little bit of parity for the cervical spine. And to begin our discussion today on the cervical spine, let's just begin by saying that all the principles that we talked about with regards to the lumbar spine, and specifically with regards to L5 radiculopathy, all of those principles apply also to the cervical spine. Cervical spine, we're looking for true objective findings for radiculopathy, not simply looking for examinee complaints of pain that appear to be in a dermatomal distribution, but rather we're focused on the true objective findings. We do sensory, motor, and reflex examination testing for the cervical spine nerve roots, just as we do for the lumbar spine nerve roots. So those principles of those examination procedures remains constant for the cervical spine. For the cervical spine, we also have nerve root stretch tests, just as we have for the lumbar spine. So all of the principles of our part 3 discussion apply also to the cervical spine. And then also with regards to the cervical spine, we're going to have clinical findings that appear globally. For example, when an examinee has C5 radiculopathy, we expect, because of the widespread distribution of the C5 nerve root, we expect to see a global constellation of clinical findings that lends support, each finding lends support to the other finding, and collectively allow us to comfortably and confidently conclude both for a diagnosis of cervical radiculopathy and then also, if applicable, a permanent impairment rating for cervical radiculopathy. So we look at the examinee and their clinical findings globally rather than focusing on single or isolated clinical findings. So all of those principles apply equally to the cervical spine as to the lumbar spine. So for today, what I thought we would do is have a brief anatomy review of the cervical spine and the brachial plexus, and talk just ever so briefly about the radiculopathy syndromes involving C5, C6, and C7, which are the most common of the cervical spine radiculopathy syndromes. So I'm going to get out some drawing pens and a drawing board, and we'll have a brief review of the cervical spine. And I call today's presentation, I call it a tribute to the brachial plexus. A tribute to the brachial plexus, and I hope you enjoys today's presentation. So I'll be back with you in just a couple minutes as we conclude our 4-part series on radiculopathy, today with a tribute to the brachial plexus. Relationship to the cervical spine nerve roots, and relate that anatomy to some of the common radiculopathy syndromes that we see, specifically radiculopathy of C5, C6, and C7. So let's begin by drawing in some of the anatomy, and let's start first with the anatomy of the vertebrae. So let's draw in the vertebrae. This will be the first cervical vertebrae, the atlas. Here's second cervical vertebrae. Okay, there's C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, T1, and let's draw in also T2. Okay? Now remember that in the cervical spine, the nerve roots are named for the vertebra below the nerve root. So here, this is the C1 nerve root. Here is the C2 nerve root. Here is the C3 nerve root. See how the nerve roots are named for the vertebra below? Here's C4. Here's C5. Here's C6. Here's C7, here's C8, here's T1, and this represents a transition zone here where the thoracic and lumbar spine nerve roots then become named for the vertebra above the nerve root. So the T2 nerve root is named for the vertebra above. It actually comes out below the named vertebra. In the cervical spine, the nerve root comes out above the named vertebra and is named for the vertebra below. Okay? Now, with regards to the cervical spine nerve roots, remember that each of these nerve roots is formed through the union of many rootlets. So let's draw in some of the rootlets. These cervical spine nerve roots are segmental, and they are derived from the union or the confluence of segmental rootlets. So let's draw in some of the rootlets. Okay, so those would look like that, all contributing to the named cervical spine nerve root. Now, after the nerve root comes out and is formed through the union of ventral and dorsal roots, the nerve root then immediately divides, and it gives off a posterior primary ramus, which then goes on to innervate the paraspinal muscles. So with regards to the brachial plexus, we're limiting our focus and our discussion to the anterior primary rami that then go out to innervate the axial and limb muscles. Okay? Now all of this here, C1 and C4, along with several of the cranial nerves, those contribute to form the cervical plexus. Okay, so C1 through C4, plus some of the lower cranial nerves like the hypoglossal nerve, etc., contribute to the cervical plexus, and then C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1 then give us the brachial plexus. Okay, so let's talk about now the brachial plexus. Okay, so with the brachial plexus, we have C5, C6, C7, C8, all forming and contributing to the brachial plexus. And we see that C5, C6, C4, and C3 first contribute to the phrenic nerve. And I won't label the phrenic nerve because that'll make our diagram busy. But after that, these anterior primary rami then begin to travel in multiple directions and create many mixings and interminglings of nerve root fibers to ultimately give us the named peripheral nerves of the upper extremity. So what we see is that the C5 and C6 nerve roots combine. The C7 nerve root continues on uncombined. The C8 and T1 nerve roots combine. And this gives us the formation of the superior, the middle, and the inferior trunks. So this is incredible and this is fascinating. 5 nerve roots condense and coalesce to give us 3 named trunks. So we have a condensation of nerve roots to give us the superior, the middle, and the inferior trunks. Now, immediately off of the C5 nerve root, we have the formation of our first named peripheral nerve, the dorsal scapular nerve. Dorsal scapular nerve goes on to innervate the rhomboids and the levator scapulae muscles, the periscapular muscles. Immediately after the formation of the superior trunk, we see the nerve to the subclavius muscle. Okay? Well, after this, it's fascinating because each of the 3 trunks then divide. And they divide into anterior and posterior divisions. So the superior trunk divides. The middle trunk divides. The inferior trunk divides. And they divide into 2 divisions. We have an anterior division and a posterior division. We have an anterior division and a posterior division, now of the medial cord. We have an anterior division and a posterior division of the inferior cord. So we started with 5 nerve roots, we went to 3 trunks, and then we ended up with 6 divisions. Anterior and posterior divisions. And at this point you start to get an idea that the nerve roots are traveling and intermingling and mixing much like there are intersections at a superhighway. So for example, if we take a look here at simply C7, we see that C7 starts to run now in a couple of different courses. It courses through the anterior division, it courses through the posterior division. What about C6? Well, C6 also is going to course through its anterior division and through its posterior division. What about C1? Travels anterior and posterior division, also with fibers from C8. So we're starting to see mixing and dividing and intermingling of these various nerve root fibers, or these nerve root fibers from the different levels of the spinal cord. Now we're out here at the divisions. So what happens from here on is fascinating. All of the posterior divisions unite to form the posterior cord. Okay? So the posterior division of the superior trunk, the posterior division of the middle trunk, the posterior division of the inferior trunk all combine to give us the posterior cord. So that handles all of the posterior divisions. Well, what happens to the three anterior divisions? Well, these two anterior divisions combine to give us, this is the posterior cord, this gives us the medial cord. These anterior divisions combine to give us the inferior cord. And let me erase this. Sorry, I drew this incorrectly. To give us the inferior cord. So we have medial cord, posterior cord, and an inferior cord. We started with 5 nerve roots, went to 3 trunks, went to 6 divisions, and now we're down to 3 cords. Now, the posterior cord continues along and eventually becomes the radial nerve. It becomes the radial nerve after it gives off a branch, which is the axillary nerve. Innervates the deltoid, supraspinatus, parts of the infraspinatus. So both the radial nerve and the axillary nerves are wholly derived from the posterior cord. The medial cord then divides, and one of its branches continues on as the musculocutaneous nerve. Musculocutaneous. One of its divisions unites with a branch from the inferior cord to become the median nerve. While another branch of the inferior cord continues along uninterrupted and unjoined to become the ulnar nerve. So these are the 5 named peripheral nerves, 5 major named peripheral nerves of the upper extremity. In addition to those, off of the posterior cord, we have the upper subscapular nerve, which serves a portion of the subscapularis muscle. We have the thoracodorsal nerve, which is the nerve to the latissimus dorsi. And we have the lower subscapular nerve, all of these coming off the posterior cord. This also serves the subscapularis muscle. Off of the ulnar nerve, we have both the medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve along with the lateral antebrachial cutaneous nerve. And then from both the medial and inferior cord, we have sort of an anastomotic branch, a fascinating anastomotic branch that goes from the medial cord. Let's draw this in a different color. Let's draw this in red. And I hope you can see this. From the medial cord to the lateral cord. If I labeled this inferior cord, I meant to label this the lateral cord. I'm sorry. And these cords, by the way, are named in relation to the axillary artery. So the posterior cord is posterior to the axillary artery, medial cord and lateral cord respectively. So from the medial cord we have an anastomotic branch that connects to the lateral cord, and this is a fascinating branch that gives rise to the lateral pectoral nerve, and then a branch here from the medial gives a branch to the known as the medial pectoral nerve. And the lateral pectoral nerve serves the pectoralis major, serves the clavicular head of the pectoralis major, whereas the medial pectoral nerve serves the pec minor, and then also the sternocostal head of the pectoralis major. So it's fascinating. Look at the nerve root contributions to both the medial and lateral pectoral nerves, and this is an example of how these nerve roots, these C5 through T1 nerve roots, go in a variety of different directions to form various combinations with the other nerve roots to give us these named peripheral nerves. Now, with regards to the medial pectoral nerve, notice that we have contributions from C8 and T1 carrying along through the lateral cord and up into this anastomotic branch. So at this point here, we have fibers from C8 and T1. With regards to the lateral pectoral nerve, we have fibers from C5, fibers from C6, contributing to this anastomotic branch to make up the lateral pectoral nerve, but also these C5 and C6 fibers continue on, and so there's two-way directional flow of these nerve root fibers, and in this way C5 and C6 contribute to the medial pectoral nerve. And in this way C8 and T1 contribute to the lateral pectoral nerve. Is that incredible? Is that incredible? Now, of course, the primary innervation of the lateral pectoral nerve is C5, C6, but there is minor contribution also from C8 and T1, and the same story prevails with regards to the medial pectoral nerve. Isn't that incredible? And the same story holds for each of these named peripheral nerves. They're each made up and comprised of multiple nerve root fibers. For example, let's take a look at the axillary nerve. If we trace the axillary nerve back through the posterior cord, we see that it receives the majority of its contribution from C5 and C6, but there are also trace fibers from C7, trace fibers from C8 and T1. It's considered primarily innervated by C5 and C6, but through these diagrams we see that indeed there are fibers from each of the nerve roots within the axillary nerve. And similar situations prevail for the other nerves as well. Probably the main exception to this would be the ulnar nerve, which receives contribution only from C8 and T1. But some textbooks will tell you that indeed there's also contribution from C7, as can be seen by the contribution of C7 here to the lateral cord. Okay? So in this way we can see that the distribution of the nerve roots is much greater than the distribution of each of the named peripheral nerves, because nerve roots contribute to more than one named peripheral nerve. Okay? So let's talk about radiculopathy then. What about cases of radiculopathy? Well, let's talk about a disc lesion here at the C5, C6 spinal level. Here's C5, here's C6. Here's a herniated disc. That's going to affect the C6 nerve root. C6 nerve root is going to innervate the nerve to the subclavius. It's going to contribute to the radial nerve. It's going to contribute to the musculocutaneous nerve. It's going to contribute to the median nerve as well. A widespread distribution of findings associated with C6 radiculopathy. So what would that be? Findings in the shoulder, findings in the upper arm, the biceps, the brachialis, findings into the hand, the intrinsic muscles of the hand, some of the muscles of the forearm, pronator teres, all innervated by the median nerve. What about a case of C7 radiculopathy? In other words, a herniated disc at the C6 spinal level. That's going to affect the C7 nerve root. That's going to affect the possibly down into the ulnar distribution. It's going to affect the radial nerve through the posterior cord. It's going to affect the radial nerve here and also the median nerve. I think I said radial nerve, I meant median nerve. It's going to affect the radial nerve. We know that the radial nerve is the great extensor nerve of the upper extremity. So this is going to affect the elbow extensor, the tricep, all of the wrist extensors, all of the finger extensors, all associated with radiculopathy of C7. Finally, what about a disc bulge more rarely now at C7 T1 disc? It's going to affect the C8 nerve root. This is going to involve the radial nerve. This is going to involve the ulnar nerve. This is going to involve parts of the median nerve as well. Now we know that the majority of the C8 fibers travel to become part of the ulnar nerve, but also gives us some contribution to the median nerve, and then to a lesser degree through the posterior cord, the radial nerve as well. So the point of this discussion is to show you that the cervical spine nerve roots have wide and far-ranging distributions. That's why it's important to know the major muscles that are innervated by each of these named peripheral nerves. That gives us some indication as to the involvement of C5 and the widespread involvement of C5, and gives us some idea as to the different muscles that we need to examine with our manual muscle testing as part of our spinal nerve root examination. So doctors, I hope this brief review of the glorious anatomy of the brachial plexus has been a refresher for you, and that it woke up a couple of dormant synapses about the marvelous anatomy of this area. And I hope this helps you understand better the radiculopathy syndromes now of the cervical spine. It makes you more aware and more cognizant basically of the anatomy as you go into your next cervical spine examination. So I want to draw this program on radiculopathy to a close. It's been my pleasure to be with you throughout this series. I look forward to being with you on future series in the weeks and months going forward from here. So for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.